Poland, okay? And it operated primarily between the two world wars. And it was, there were schools in high schools, all of them where the instruction was in Hebrew. There was also theaters. There were a newspaper that they were written in Hebrew. And I'm telling you all of this because my father, who grew up in Lithuania, it was in Kovna, was a part of this movement. He was a child, and he studied in a high school in Hebrew. With all the instruction was in Hebrew, and he was a part of the theater in Kovna that played and acted. All of it was in Hebrew, and he got a certificate to immigrate to Israel in 1935. You could not just go. This was just before the war. In 39, he got a certificate because he was an actor in Hebrew. A theater in Israel uh, invited him, and I have to say that Hebrew saved his life. Being an actor in Hebrew saved his life. His family was not as lucky as that. So we have a whole immigration coming to Israel, and they speak all kinds of languages, and they had a campaign for everybody to speak Hebrew. So here it says, the center one language, one people, for yours and your children's sake, learn Hebrew. On the right, speak Hebrew for mutual understanding. So everybody understands each other only if we have one language. And on the left, all of those old languages, English, Francais, Italiano, Magyar, which is Hungarian, Polski, which is Polish, and Romanian. Those are the old darkness, European, and on the right is Ivrit. It's beautiful countryside, blue skies, the new Jew and the old Jew, right? So all of those languages, forget them, leave them behind, and become a true Israeli by speaking Hebrew. And this is how we grew up. Anila and Zahava and me, all of this, we're the generation of like the state of Israel. I am the oldest of the three. I was born a year after the establishment of the state of Israel. And we grew up on that ethos. Now, even my mother grew up on that ethos. And in the house, my father, who spoke many, many languages, but he loved Yiddish, he was not, she forbade my father from speaking Yiddish in the house, and nobody could speak, in the house, those languages. And people were discouraged from speaking these languages to their children. And I know a lot of children today who are my age and older regret it. They sort of lost some of those languages. But when you make a revolution, when you build a new nation, I guess you have to make some changes that we later regret. So now we're going to look at those identities that we talk about. We started with the Hebrew. I gave you just a introduction to that language as an identity. So I chose for Hebrew, I chose a lyrics to a song that became an anthem. I read it in Hebrew and then in English. אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת אל אורכי, אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. I have no other country, even if my land is aflame. Only a word in Hebrew pierces my veins and my soul with a painful body, with a starved heart. Here is my home. This was written by Ehud Manor, and it's a song that you might know, and I'm not going to sing it. Only the Hebrew language and not any other language penetrates my heart and soul. And through my deep connection to the language, I understand how deep my connection to the land is. This was written in 1986. It's a belated reaction to his beloved brothers falling in the war of attrition. The war of attrition was after the Six-Day War between 1967 and 1970. And this song became a sort of an anthem in reaction to the First Lebanon War in 1982, which was considered by many to be a war of choice rather than a war of no choice. Since then, many from all sides of the political spectrum have adopted it as a sort of an anthem of against war and a love of country. So I highlighted country and land, Hebrew and home. So the connection, land, person, and language is apparent in this poem. And I think Israelis truly connect and identify with this verse because in like six lines, it encompasses the connection between land, identity, and language. So this is my take on it. I'm looking at the clock to see if I'm on time. Okay, we're going now to Yiddish. Now, of all the languages that we saw on the left, you know, from Europe, Yiddish was the symbol of the old Jew from the old country, from the dark diaspora. And I'm saying all of this, you know, as we thought at the time or as we were taught at the time. So it was like, it's like the worst thing you could do was speak Yiddish as a young person. Avraham Sutzkover was very well known in the world as one of the best Yiddish poets, and he was almost unknown in Israel. He was born in 1913 in Belarus, and he was a Yiddish language poet whose works chronicled both his childhood in Siberia, where his family fled during World War I, his life in the Vilna ghetto during World War II, and his escape to join the Jewish partisans. All of his songs describe all of those elements in his biography. He was also part of what is called the Paper Brigade. You can check it later. It was the name given to a group of residents in the Vilna ghetto that hid and smuggled out of the ghetto a large collection of Jewish cultural items. Thanks to them, it was saved from the Nazis when they got into the Vilna ghetto. Sutzkover also testified at the Nuremberg trials, and in 1947 in Palestine at the time with the help of Golda Meir, who was, I think she was through the Jewish Agency. In a New York Times obituary, he was that famous, it was written, in the post-war world, he was the most important Jewish poet and a world-class poet in general. People thought he should have gotten the Nobel Prize. The tragedy of Sutzkover was that not many people in Israel knew him, me included. I actually heard about him from a young cousin of mine, like a second or third cousin, who is a poet himself. He's like in early 30s. And he was in touch with him. He managed to actually be in touch with the Sutzkover before he died. And he told me about him. So I see myself as lucky to have known a little bit about him. So I'm going to now, because Sutzkover refused to switch to Hebrew, he continued to write and to publish, self-publish himself. He was finally translated to Hebrew not long ago. And this is a poem that I will read to you in English. And then I have a nice surprise for you. This is, I see it as a lament on the state of the Yiddish language in Israel. Shall I begin from the beginning? Shall I, like Abraham, break up all idols, beloved and hated? Shall I, alive and kicking, get myself translated? Shall I put down my tongue as seed and wait until transformed it would grow up a patriarchal plant to chant of raisins and almonds? Oh, what a silly joke my bearded brother poet's making, that my mother tongue will soon go under. In 100 years from now, I fear, we shall discuss the very thing right there, right here, near the Jordan River. For the question broods and bores. If one knows exactly where the prayer of the Berdichever, Yehoash song, and Kulbak's wander to go under, let him indicate perchance where the languages goes. When they're under, near the Wailing Wall perhaps? If so, then I shall go, and open my mouth, bristling with rage and fury, and like a lion, swallow up the language that goes under. Swallow it, and rouse the ages with my roar and thunder. So he actually is shouting out that the language, how am I going to, where am I going to bury it? Because it's not accepted by the, here's what we talked about. If your language is in cahoots with the majority language, what happens to it? Now, I want you to hear it in Yiddish. Now, I know how to read Yiddish because my father taught me in secret how to read Yiddish when my mother was out of the house. But I don't understand Yiddish, so I can, but I did get someone to read it for us. Her name is Anna Gonchor. She used to be a faculty lecturer of Yiddish studies at McGill University in Canada. And she is now a lecturer of Yiddish language, Yiddish literature at Bard Evo Institute. So I did put the words on the right side. You see it. I'm sorry, it's not going to be as clear as the other one, but we're going to hear her read it.
Yiddish. Soll ich anheben von Anheb? Soll ich, wie Abraham, aus Bruderschaft zerhacken alle Götzen? Soll ich sich ein lebendiger Losen übersetzen? Soll ich einpflanzen mein Zung und warten, bis verwandeln wird sich in ovistige Rojinkes mit Mandeln? Was für ein kathovistische Witzen darschend mein Poesiebruder mit die Backen werden, als mein Mameloschen geht bald unter. Mir werden noch in 100 Jahren herum, da kennt ich sitzen und führen die Diskussion beim Jarden, weil Scheile nogt und nogelt. Ob weiß genau, wo die Twille von Barditschewer, Jeschelin und Kulbaks wogelt zu dem Untergang, da soll mir ein Steger anweisen, wohin die Sprache geht unter. Schon bei dem Kelssar Vavi, über so, will ich dort kommen, öffnen das Maul und wie ein Leib ungetan in feierdicken Zunter, einschlingen dem Loschen, was geht unter. Einschlingen und alle Deures wecken mit mein Brummen.
Amazing.
It's an amazing poem.
Amazing poem. So what is your read on this poem? Your personal read?
In the poet's absolute refusal to accept that Yiddish is on the decline or will disappear. That it's just not possible, that it's rhetoric, pure rhetoric.
In the talk that I'm giving, I'm actually going to talk about the fact that Yiddish was excluded, not inclusion of Yiddish, as part of the amalgam of languages in Israel, in the state of Israel, but the intentional exclusion of it. And so his voice was one of a kind in a way.
Yes, absolutely. In that it was it's interesting because modern Yiddish literature was very much a revolution, right? It was counter the existing culture. It was counter the idea of the Haskalah, right? And although it's born out of the Haskalah, it was against the idea of the Haskalah, which ultimately was assimilation, right? And it was also very much a statement about diaspora nationalism.
Yes.
There were certain Zionists, the Politzion was very much in the Yiddishist world, but beyond that, it was very much part of the diaspora and modernity.
Yes.
Yiddish modernity came into the Jewish world through Yiddish.
It sounds like an oxymoron, but
doesn't it? But yet, that's how the Jewish world encountered modernity, and that's through Yiddish and through modern Yiddish literature and modern.
Okay, so you see that I had a long conversation with her, and she's really she taught me a lot, and she's a great she's a friend of a friend. So now we're talking about. So I have to say though that I think that the Tutzkover, who died in 2010, he probably saw already that there was a revival of the revival of Yiddish, because it's now there is even a theater in Israel now in Yiddish that is very popular, and many actors and who play there don't even know Yiddish and just learn the lines. There also an acceptance really and a revival of Sutzkover work as well. And so I'm happy to say that not only in the United States there is a revival of Yiddish with the theater. I myself saw in in New York a few years ago a Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. So it was delightful, even though I didn't, with subtitles, with super titles. So this is Yiddish, which was a language that was not accepted, and a language that many people came with from the old country and were not allowed to speak or were looked upon as weird by the younger generation. We're going to talk now about Arabic. So 20% of the population in Israel is Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis. And many of them, or most of them, are completely bilingual. Salman Masalha was born in 1953 in Al Maghar, an Arab town in the Galilee. And he has lived in Jerusalem for many years. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Jerusalem in classic literature. He's a professor of Arab language and literature at that university, and he writes for the daily newspaper Haaretz in Hebrew. Israeli, so he is bilingual. He teaches in Arabic and in Hebrew, and therefore it's a very interesting twist here. Israeli Hebrew poetry, as we saw from even from the 6 lines of Ehud Manor, depicts a triangle of the 3 elements: territory or land or state of Israel, language, Hebrew, and identity, Jewish. This is for Hebrew poetry, Israeli Hebrew poetry. Masala, by being a bilingual author, writing and publishing both Arabic and Hebrew, challenges this interrelation of territory, language, and identity. The very activity of Arab writers in Hebrew, and he is not the only one, fundamentally changes the definition that reduces Hebrew literature to being Jewish literature. So we are going to read a poem by him. I hope you understand what I mean. What I mean is that now we have Hebrew literature in Israel that is not necessarily Jewish, because many Arabs write in Hebrew. This is his poem. I write in he wrote it in Hebrew, of course. I write in the Hebrew language, which is not my mother tongue, to lose myself in the world. He who doesn't get lost will never find the hole, because everyone has the same toes, left big toe by right heel. And sometimes I write Hebrew to cool the blood that spurts endlessly from my heart. It's always like that. There are many treasures in the coffer I've built in my chest. But the colors of the night that was spread over exposed walls peel without ever knowing what all this wonder is. And I write in Hebrew to get lost in my words and also to find a bit of interest for my footsteps. I've not stopped walking. Many paths have I traveled, engraved by my hands. I shall take my feet in hand and meet many people and make them all my friends. Who is foreign? Who far? Who near? There is no strangeness in the ways of the world, because strangeness mostly lies in a man's heart. Now he talks about the loss of orientation, both linguistic and therefore of identity. It's depicted in the poem as the only orientation possible in a world that is full of, in the beginning, it talks about violence and pain. He refers to the land here by talking about walking and crawling and digging with hands. This is how close he gets to the land. So we're talking identity, land, and language. The identity with which the poet chooses to define himself is linked to place by virtue of the fact that his present is as a native. He is a native of this land, this is his homeland, and not by a national connection. So the Arab Israeli, this is his homeland, just like it is the Israeli, the Jewish homeland. And this, he mentioned several things that we already talked about strange, being a stranger in your own homeland. Remember, we saw Raida Adon, the video where she talks about being a stranger in her own land. So the word strangeness here is not only as being strange, but being a stranger. And another interesting thing is the fact that the loss of orientation, the word orient is the orient, the east. And disorientation is the loss of the east. So we're talking about a country that is in the east and it's eastern, and disorientation for being there is jarring for him. So he talks about strangeness and disorientation. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's go now. I have another twist for you. If Yiddish was out because it was from the diaspora, Arabic is out because it's the language of the enemy. And I'm talking about Jews. Jews who spoke Yiddish, that was the language of the diaspora, and Jews whose language is Arabic. Some Jews are, the mother tongue is Arabic. It was out because it was the language of the enemies. And so Jews who spoke Arabic might be mistaken for Arabs, whatever that implies. So a youngish, born in 1969, is pretty young. Eli Eliyahu is one of my favorites now, wrote this poem, growing up with a family whose language was Arabic. Under the ground. And how can I help it if for me, the operation succeeded and Baghdad died, and all that is left is the music that my father used to listen to on the stations of shame while waiting in the underground parking lot to drive me to the People's Army on his way to work. And I will never forget the sadness of his hand as it gropes for the Hebrew to switch quickly before we leave and ascend above ground. I'm going to read it in Hebrew also. מתחת לפני האדמה. ומה לעשות שאצלי הניתוח הצליח ובגדד מתה, ולא נותרה אלא המוסיקה שהיה אבי שומע בתחנות הבושה, שהמתין בחניון התת-קרקעי לקחת אותי אל צבא העם בדרכו לעבודה. ולא אשכח לעולם את עצב ידו המגששת אחר העברית להחליף מהר לפני שיוצאים ועולים מעל פני האדמה. So, this is the scene. They're in the underground garage, and his father is going to drive him to the army base, and he listens to Arabic music on the radio. But as soon as they come out of the underground, the whole thing, of course, is symbolic. He switches quickly to a Hebrew station because he's ashamed. In the beginning, of course, Umala thought, and how can I help it if the operation succeeded and Baghdad was torn out of me? So I am the next generation, and Baghdad is no longer in my heart. So his father is from Iraq, he's a Baghdadi. So Arabic, in some places where Arabs and Jews live together, it was not like that. But for young people in Israel to grow up with a family who spoke Arabic, they used to be ashamed of it. So this is one of those songs, one of those poems that expresses the fact that Arabic. So we have an Arab who writes in Hebrew for a certain reason, and we have a Jew whose Arabic is the language of shame. So we can see how all mixed up those identities are, and how when you are in where the majority language is one and you are of another ethnic group, or if your majority language is of the other, it's a whole mess, right? And we're going to end with one of my favorite, and a woman. Her name is Adi Kelssar. She's the youngest. We are going from the older to the youngest. Adi Kelssar, she was born in Jerusalem, in the Gilo neighborhood. She's the third of four children of her family, and they are of Yemeni descent. So her parents are from Yemen. And from a young age, according to her, she experienced bullying and discrimination because her dark skin color. And according to she thought, because of it, she thought she belonged to a low social status group. During army service, I'm reading her bio, she began to develop her Mizrahi identity. Mizrahi today, we used to sort of separate between Sephardic, or people who came from Spain, and Mizrahi, people who came from Arab lands or from the Eastern, like Iraq and Iran and Yemen, and all the Middle Eastern countries. But today, basically, we call all of those people from those countries, and the descendants call themselves Mizrahi, which is Eastern, from the Mizrach, from the East. She traveled abroad, and when she came back, she began working as a cultural reporter for newspapers. Now, Ars Poetica, as you see, I wrote here Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica usually we spell with Aleph. This is spelled with Ain in Hebrew. Ars Poetica, which means is a play of words on the Latin phrase that means the art of poetry, like writing about how to write poetry, the musing about writing poetry. It's a play on word because ars in Hebrew, first of all, ars in Arabic means a pimp. But in Israeli Hebrew slang, it's a derogatory term of a Mizrahi man with connotation to being macho and vulgar. So Adi Kelssar wanted to reclaim the word, as some of us did with the word queer. You know, first it was a derogatory, but if you call yourself queer, it doesn't mean that anymore. And she made it into a source of pride. Her original intention was to hold a single event of people of Mizrahi descent who wanted to read the poetry, a spoken word, hip hop, and others. She thought it will be a single event, but it was so successful that it became a monthly popular event. So since the majority of literary Israeli canon is much like in other countries, is a white man's masculine Ashkenazi, and she's a feminine Mizrahi. So she thought that her poetry would be marginalized and excluded from the consensus, and Ars Poetica created a space for those marginalized to express themselves and their art publicly. I'm happy to say that some of her work, some of her poems are already taught in high school. So I'm going to play the video, and the lyrics are right there on the side, and then we'll talk about it. So this it's spoken word. It's called Ani HaMizrachit. I'm the Mizrahi, the woman, and this is one of the most famous songs. So let's play it.
אני המזרחית שאתם לא מכירים, אני המזרחית שאתם לא מזכירים, שיודעת לדקלם את כל השירים של זוהר ארגוב וקוראת על בר קאמי ובולגקוב, מערבבת הכל לאט לאט על אש קטנה, שחור ולבן, בשר וחלב, העדים מרעילים את השמיים כחול לבן שלכם, מה תעשו לי? אני נושמת בעברית, קונה באנגלית, אוהבת בערבית, כפרה על הסורק, מתבחיינת במזרחית. The revolution will not be televised, the revolution will not be televised, כי בטלוויזיה יש רק פרסומות של כל מיני בלונדיניות. אולי בגלל זה קראו לי בבית ספר קושית בהפסקות. אני באמצע לא לכאן ולא לכאן, אם הייתי צריכה לבחור, הייתי בוחרת אפרו תימן, מה תעשו לי? אל תגיד לי איך להיות מזרחית, גם אם קראת אדוארד סעיד, כי אני המזרחית שלא מפחדת ממך, לא ברעיונות עבודה, לא בוועדות קבלה ולא בשדות תעופה. למרות שאתה שואל אותי לא מעט שאלות, בעיניים מאשימות, מחפשות בי שאריות ערביות, לכמה זמן הגעת וכמה כסף יש לך, לא באת לכאן לעבוד נכון, לא באת לכאן לעבוד נכון, מה תעשה לי? והנה אני עומדת במרכז השבע, רחוק מהפריפריה הרעבה, ולמדתי לדבר אקדמית, לנסוע בקו 25, ולמדוד את המרחק בין השכל ללב, רק כדי להבין את הדרך לבית שלי, איפה שאמא ואבא אף פעם לא דחפו לי ספר ליד, אבל קרחו את הנשמה שלהם בשלי בהוצאה עצמית, בכל פעם שלקחו אותי לספרייה העירונית, בכל פעם שביקשו, אל תקראי בחושך, יהרסו לך העיניים, אז יצאתי לאור, מה תעשו לי?
Okay. So I translated not all of it because I didn't have space here also, but she speaks directly to the other. She's the other, but she speaks to the others, sometimes in a plural and sometimes in singular. And she does it. The people that she mentions and the things that she said, I know about, I read Albert Camus and Bulgakov, she shows how really educated she is. And there are also all kinds of little details underlying. So Albert Camus is known for writing The Stranger, and Bulgakov especially known for the book The Master and Margarita. I don't know if you read it. And in it, it's basically a confrontation between a writer and the authority. So she's also writer authority. There are other details like Edouard Said, who's a professor in Columbia and is basically is the creator of post-colonial studies. So she intertwines all kinds of symbols that we are supposed to get, some of us get. Also, the revolution will not be televised. I'm sure some of you know who that is, and it's a call for the Black movement in the United States, actually, the African American movement. So she's very knowledgeable, but what she really is standing on her own. You will not tell me how to be and what to be. And she's therefore very successful as the creator of Ars Poetica and the leader. And I think this is it. And we have a few minutes to close. So I'm hoping that I think I chose some things that are surprising, maybe, and different. And all of them were a bit with a twist. So the Yiddish was the Yiddish that is dead in Israel, maybe we'll resurrect it. The Arab who writes in Hebrew, and the Mizrahi woman who finally has a voice, Ars Poetica. So I'm going to stop the share so I can see all of you. And we are, and unmute yourself if you want.